Hi and welcome to your first video for your Summer Independent Learning 2022, and today we're going to have a look at A2, which is Psychological Approaches to Health, Wellbeing and Illness, and we're still on Learning Aim A, which is Lifestyle Choices and Health Related Behaviour. So this learning aim is called Learning Aim A2, and we're looking at psychological approaches to health, well-being and illness. And the first approach we're going to do today is the biological approach. So you may already have a little bit of an idea about the biological approach based on your exam that you sat a couple of weeks ago for your Unit 1. So we are going to be revisiting some of the ideas from some of the knowledge that you've already got from Unit 1, but also building on it and now applying it to health, well-being and illness. So if you haven't already, if you would like to get your booklet 1 out, so your BTEC Applied Psychology, Health Psychology, and it's booklet 1, and we are on page 13 of your booklet. So 13 has got the specification, which you're just going to have a quick look at, and then we'll turn on to page 14, which has got the content. So make sure you've got a pen. If you need to pause the video at any point, if you would like to rewind anything or go back over anything, please feel free to do that. Please ensure you watch the full video and listen to everything, as well as filling in your booklet at the relevant points. I'll make it really clear to you when you need to fill in different parts of your booklet. So we're going to start by looking at the biological influences of health, well-being and illness. So you already will have a little bit of an idea, and we'll do a bit of a recap over the biological approach. And then in the next 3 videos, you're going to cover the behaviourist approach, and then social learning approach, and then cognitive approach. So this part of the course is really about understanding sort of definitions and using your knowledge of the approaches to apply it to health, well-being and illness. So how does, for example, the biological approach explain health, well-being and illness? And then we'll look at some of the key aspects which you can see here. So you've got genetics and the role of neurotransmitter imbalances as well. So what can you actually remember from Unit 1 for the biological approach? So it might be a good idea just to pause the video for a minute, do a little bit of a mind map, and give yourself maybe 5 minutes just to do a little bit of a mind map and to recap over what you can remember about the biological approach. There is some clues on the screen for you now. So if you'd like to pause the video and then press play when you're ready to go through the recap. So welcome back. We're going to just quickly go over some of the key aspects of the biological approach before we then start to apply it to health. So you might have written a couple of these things down. If you haven't, feel free to add this to your mind map or your notes. So one of the explanations of behaviour the biological approach gives is through our genes and our genetic makeup. So obviously your genes are what you inherit from your parents, and they can influence our behaviour. So we're going to touch on this a little bit more in a minute. You've also got the nervous system, so you've done about the different divisions of the nervous system, fight or flight. So that can also influence our behaviour, the biological approach would say. And then we've also got neurochemistry, so you will be familiar with neurotransmitters. Some of the most popular ones you probably will have heard of are serotonin and dopamine, but there are many more that you may have already looked at. And then finally we've got evolution. So again, the idea that our behaviour is passed down from generations in order to increase our chances of survival or reproduction. So we're not going to cover all of these aspects of the biological approach applied to health, but there are a couple of them that we will cover. But it's always a good idea just to recap over some of those ideas as a little bit of retrieval for you as well. So if you'd like to make sure you're on page 14 before we start going through it. And the first part that we're going to have a look at is what we call genetic predisposition. So the next couple of slides in this video is all about the biology, the biological approach, and how that would explain our health and well-being and behaviour. So you may have heard of the term genetic predisposition. So I'm going to cover what you've got in your booklet in the top box, and then I'll make it a little bit easier for you to understand, and we'll look at some activities. So a genetic predisposition is an increased likelihood of developing a particular disease based on a person's genetic makeup. So there's quite a lot of terminology here. I'll help to break it down for you. So obviously genes or genetic is to do with the genes that you inherit. A predisposition means that you are sort of exposed to something. It's this increased likelihood of you developing a disease based on a person's genetic makeup. So I'll talk you through this slide and then I'll break it down for you a little bit more. So if we have particular genes, that could lead to the development of a disease, but it doesn't directly mean that you are going to get that disease. So for example, if your parents have a particular gene for something, you may inherit that gene, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you are definitely going to get that genetic disorder or disease or whatever characteristic it is. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Some people who do have this genetic predisposition won't ever actually develop the disease. So you can actually carry genes for certain disorders or behaviours, but they may never actually become expressed. And this can happen even within the same family. So, for example, if your parents carry a particular gene for a disability, for example, you might inherit it, but your sibling may not. And that's just basically dependent on whether that gene becomes expressed. So you may have the gene, but it hasn't actually become expressed, and therefore you don't develop that disorder. And usually, although we are talking about the biological approach, there does need to be some environmental trigger for the person to develop the condition. So we'll talk about this later on in a little bit more detail, but for example, schizophrenia, which you may have studied when you were doing your Unit 6 coursework, that has been found to have a genetic basis, or what we're talking about here, this genetic predisposition. But you need to have a trigger in the environment, so maybe some stress or trauma, and then that then causes that gene to express, and then that person develops schizophrenia. So we'll talk about this a little bit more later on, but the main sort of takeaway message from this is that you can develop genes, you can inherit genes from your parents, and that makes you more likely to develop a disorder or a disease. But it doesn't always necessarily mean that you definitely will. So in other words, you already know that we inherit genes from our parents. You may inherit certain genes which do make you more vulnerable to developing a disease. And there's some examples here of diseases which could be inherited. So Alzheimer's disease, cancer, schizophrenia, and Down syndrome. So for example, if your parents have this gene or they carry the genetic mutation, you might be more likely or more vulnerable to developing that disease, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you will. This is where the idea of this vulnerability or this genetic predisposition comes from. So before we move on to looking at schizophrenia, we're still on page 14. Just a little bit of a recap about twins. So we've got some different types of twins on the board here. So you've got two types of twins, and identical twins are a single fertilized egg by a single sperm, and then that just splits in two. So identical twins have 100% of the same genes, and we call identical twins monozygotic, or you can write down MZ for short. So in the middle of page 14, if you would like to write monozygotic, and then you can put MZ in brackets as well. And therefore, non-identical twins are two eggs, and they are fertilised by separate sperm. So that's probably not the best picture actually there. There should be two eggs and then obviously two sperm. And they are known as dizygotic, which are DZ twins. Okay, so mono actually means one and di means two, so that might be an easy way for you to remember it. So if you just pop that into the speech bubble in the middle of page 14, that would be great. And the next task we're going to have a look at is this graph, which is telling us the genetic predisposition for schizophrenia. So schizophrenia is a psychological disorder which has certain symptoms. You may have studied this in Unit 6. So this is where people may have delusions or hallucinations, and this is the genetic predisposition depending on the relationship with the person to schizophrenia. So you can have a look here. So it might be a good idea, just before we go through it, just to pause the video and just have a look at this graph and have a think about what it might show. The bottom of page 14, you've got a little bit of a gap fill to fill in using the graph. So if you want to maybe have a read of the graph, read the gap fill, and have a think about what you think the answers are, and then we'll go through it in a couple of minutes. So if you want to pause the video and press play when you're ready. Okay, so let's have a look. So the first gap, schizophrenia is a mental disorder, and you may have already noticed that I mentioned some of the symptoms are hallucinations, delusions, disorganized speech and behaviour. Okay, so if you want to write that into the gap on page 14. And then using the graph, you should have determined the following percentages. So family studies have shown that approximately 1% of the general population suffer from schizophrenia. So if you don't have someone in your family that suffers from schizophrenia, then you have a 1% chance of developing schizophrenia. If you have a close relative, for example, 13% of children whose parents has the disorder will also have it. 48% if you've got an identical twin who has the disorder who will have it. So remember that identical twins share 100% of the same genes. So as you can see, this is where the genetic predisposition comes into play, because the more genes that you share with someone, the more likely you're going to get schizophrenia. Okay, so that's the last gap there. There's a little bit of a bonus question under there, which if you want to turn over to page 15, I'll just give you a little bit of time to write that in. So just pause the video if you want to write that in, and then press play when you're ready, and we'll have a look at the bonus question. Okay, so the bonus question, which is over the other side of the page on page 15, it says, which figure in the graph above suggests that the genes are not the only influence on schizophrenia, and why? So have a little look at the graph again. Which figure do you think suggests that genes are not the only influence on schizophrenia? Can you explain that? So again, pause the video and press play when you're ready. So the main figure that we're looking at here is identical twins. And the fact that identical twins only have a 48% genetic predisposition suggests that there must be other environmental influences. So remember that identical twins share 100% of the same genes, and therefore, if their twin has schizophrenia, if it's purely genetic, then the other twin should also have schizophrenia. But the fact that only 48% of twins, both twins, have schizophrenia suggests that there must be some environmental influence. So we talked before, didn't we, about maybe some stress or trauma in the environment. Okay, so again, if you want to fill that in and then press play when you're ready and pause the video so you can copy that in. Okay, so we're going to have a look in an example specific to smoking. So quite a lot of health psychology, we do refer back to smoking and addiction. So first of all, there has been research that has been found, so you can see you've got this already written in your book, that 53% of genetic influence is contributed to smoking. So there was a 53% likelihood of your genes influencing whether you were more likely to actually take up smoking. So what that suggests is that if you have somebody else that smokes in your family, 53%, there would be a 53% increased risk of you taking up smoking. And then we've also got a study by Vink. So you've got a big box at the bottom of page 15 if you would like to fill that in as we're going along. So this was some more research that was done by Vink et al. 2005, and they wanted to see whether genetic risk factors contribute separately to smoking initiation and nicotine dependence. So basically, how much do your genes contribute to you and whether you are likely to smoke or become addicted to nicotine. So the research involved gathering smoking-related data from the Netherlands Twin Register between 1991 and 2000. So if you just want to listen, and then in a minute you can pause the video and write it into your booklet. The data came from 868 MZ, so they're your identical twin pairs, and 704 non-identical DZ. So remember, monozygotic is MZ and dizygotic is DZ. And there was a final survey where smokers and ex-smokers completed a phagostrom test for nicotine dependence. This is a questionnaire testing nicotine dependence. And the findings were that for smoking initiation, 44% of the variation between individuals was explained by genetic factors. 75% of the variation between individuals was explained by genetic factors as well for nicotine dependence, so people actually becoming dependent on nicotine. Smoking initiation is basically when people are starting to actually engage in smoking behaviour, so basically just starting smoking. And Vink concluded that genetic factors do make a substantial contribution to the initiation of smoking, so beginning smoking and also becoming dependent, so that's when you actually become addicted. So if you want to just summarise that onto page 15 in that big box, press pause and then press play when you're ready to move on to page 16. Okay, so we're going to have a look at another example. So just to save you a bit of time, I've done one for you. So we're going to have a look at the genetic predisposition of depression. If you wanted to do some of your own research, feel free to pause the video and have a little bit of a Google search simply by putting in genetic predisposition and depression and see if anything comes up. But if you want to, if you'd prefer just to go through it with me, then feel free to copy down from the slide in a second. Okay, so for depression, research has suggested that the environment, genes and the environment have an interaction, and that indicates whether someone develops depression. Okay, so it's basically saying that genes can cause depression, but also the interaction with the environment may also develop depression as well. And researchers found that someone with a first-degree relative diagnosed with depression, so that's thinking about parent, sibling or child, could be 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with depression compared to the general population. So what that tells us then is that there is a genetic predisposition, that if you have somebody in your family who has depression, you are more likely to develop depression, 3 times more likely. But remember, it's only a genetic predisposition. It doesn't mean you're definitely going to get that disorder. It just means it increases your chances of developing that particular disorder, in this case depression. And researchers also suggested that women may be more susceptible to the genetic influences associated with depression than men. So you can write that into page 16 and then you just write it in the left-hand box because that is the research that backs it up. Okay, so you can copy it into either box on top of page 16. Quite importantly though, that remember that heredity, or if you are inheriting a gene, it's a complex combination of factors. So it doesn't mean that you definitely will get depression. It could be a combination of lots of different factors, including genes, the environment, or even a combination between the two. So if you want to pause the video, just copy that up onto the top of page 16, and then we'll move on to neurotransmitters in a minute. Okay, so the next section for the biological approach is looking at the role of neurotransmitters. So little brain, little spider diagram there. So if you want to do this for 5 minutes before we go through it, it's a really good retrieval activity just to see what you already know, and then we can build on that in a minute. So a couple of questions. What are neurotransmitters? And can you name any that you have covered this year? So any neurotransmitters that you have covered this year that you can remember. We have mentioned a couple at the start of the video. So if you want to pause the video and then press play when you're ready to go back through it. Okay, we're going to watch a quick YouTube clip on neurotransmitters. So if you just want to make sure you're watching carefully. Sorry, just bear with me.
Our brains are amazing. They think about problems, tell body parts to move, tell the stomach how to digest, figure out what we see, taste, smell, and touch. They are the boss of the body. They tell everything else how to work. They even help us feel happy, excited, scared, mad, and sad. Like all body parts, the brain can sometimes have problems working correctly, and this can lead to mental illness. Sometimes brains make people feel worried too much of the time. This is called anxiety. Some brains make people feel too much sadness. This is called depression. Other brains make people feel like they need to repeat actions and that their work is never good enough. This is called OCD. Some brains make people feel very sad at times and overly happy and excited at other times. This is called bipolar. Some brains do not communicate the message to your body that it needs to focus and stay on task. This is called ADD or ADHD. And some brains make people think they hear, see, or touch things that aren't really there, or think things that aren't true. This is called schizophrenia. Why does the brain, the boss of the whole body, not work right sometimes? Doctors and scientists are still learning, but they know it often has to do with how the brain communicates. The brain is similar to a highly organized collection of wires. It receives all the signals that come into the eyes and ears and nose and sends on messages to the mouth and feet and hands. Neurons are like the brain's wires. They are the connectors that move messages along, and there are 100 billion of them at work in the brain all the time. But neurons must talk to other neurons to move messages along, and the way they talk to each other is through chemical messengers. These messengers, called neurotransmitters, cross the tiny gaps in between neurons, ferrying messages from one neuron to the next. When a neuron gets just the right neurotransmitter at just the right time, it helps the brain concentrate, relax, shift attention, and create. But when neurotransmitters aren't able to do their job right, when there are too many messengers or too few, the message is not understood correctly. The brain loses focus, gets tired, worries, or retreats from reality. For example, when neurons called smiley serotonin don't make it across the neuron gap, the brain makes the whole body feel sad and depressed. Doctors have found that if they give a depressed patient some medicine to help smiley serotonin, it helps the brain feel happier. Doctors have discovered many medicines that help correct neurotransmitter levels in the brain.
Okay, so that was a little bit of an introduction into neurotransmitters. If you'd like to watch a full video, you can just Google on YouTube brain and neurotransmitters. So we're going to have a look at the role of neurotransmitters. So we're on page 16 still, and we've just got a little bit of a few gaps to fill in a minute. So as the video explained, the brain produces neurotransmitters, and these are chemicals which are transmitted in our brain, and they basically can help, well, they have a massive role in our behaviour basically. So if we have an over or underactivity of these chemicals, that can create an imbalance, and it can create certain symptoms which are characterised by certain disorders. So for example, it mentioned in the video, if you don't have enough serotonin, serotonin has a massive influence on lots of different things like your sleep, your mood, your appetite. So if you have an imbalance of serotonin, that can have an impact on lots of different behaviours and things that are going on in your body. So an example of this is schizophrenia, and you may already know this from Unit 6, but you may have forgotten that schizophrenia is linked to an overactivity of dopamine. So those are a couple of gaps for your booklet on the bottom, page 16. And that can lead to symptoms such as hallucinations and delusions. So thinking you hear things or see things that aren't really there. Okay, and then if you turn over to page 17, depression has been linked to underactivity of the neurotransmitter serotonin. And that can lead to issues such as low mood, sleep and appetite disruption, and a lack of pleasure in daily activities. So if you want to write that at the top of page 17. So dopamine is all to do with pleasure and reward, and serotonin is to do with mood. So it mentioned in the video that antipsychotic and antidepressant drugs, in terms of antidepressant drugs, they would increase serotonin, and that would have obviously an influence on your mood, sleep, appetite, etc. And in terms of dopamine, we would need to reduce that amount of dopamine to relieve the hallucinations and delusions. So thinking about addiction, what's been found in terms of addiction is that people have a low level, abnormally low levels of dopamine, and therefore they have a decreased ability to activate dopamine receptors in the reward centre of the brain, and we call that dopamine deficiency. So if you're deficient in something, it means you don't have enough. Okay, so people who are maybe engage in addictive behaviours, it could be because they have this low level of dopamine, and then they engage in the addictive behaviour to give them that buzz. So when you do something that's pleasurable, or you get a reward from it, a little bit of dopamine will be released in your brain. So if you have a low level of that, you might be more likely to engage in addictive behaviours because you're going to get that hit of dopamine. Okay, so you can see here, this is a picture of food. Food can also influence dopamine, so it can increase dopamine receptors, and that's a natural reward. So that's, you know, when you eat food, you feel good. You get a little bit of pleasure, don't you? Okay, and that's because you can see here those dopamine receptors being stimulated. If you look here in terms of cocaine, okay, you can see a massive surge of dopamine. So that's why some people report having these effects of euphoria and feeling really happy, and that's because if you look at that picture, you've got a massive hit of dopamine there. So you've got some questions on page 17. There is some reading to do, but to save you a bit of time, I've just summarised the article for you. But if you do want to read the article, feel free to scan the QR code on the bottom of page 17. So what causes dopamine deficiency then? reasons could be that maybe there's not enough dopamine that's being produced, so you don't actually have enough of the neurotransmitter dopamine. You might not have enough receptors to take up the dopamine. The dopamine receptors may be damaged, or the dopamine is being broken down too quickly. And dopamine deficiency can be linked to depression and anxiety, and it can lead to substance dependency. So substance dependency is where you become dependent on a substance, for example, a drug or smoking or alcohol. And how do drugs, alcohol and sugar increase dopamine levels in the brain? Well, it can actually lead to suppression of dopamine. So drugs, alcohol and sugar do increase dopamine in the brain. So when you take those things, it will increase the dopamine, but it can lead to the suppression of dopamine over time, and then you can become addicted to some of those things as well. Okay, final section of the video is just some questions to test your understanding. So if you want to pause the video and then press play in about 5 or 10 minutes when you're ready to go through the answers. Okay, so question 1, what is a genetic predisposition? It's an increased likelihood of developing a particular disease based on a person's genetic makeup. So have a look at your answer and feel free to annotate in a different colour if you need to. Carmelli et al., which was the first study, found that genetic influences contribute to 53% to the risk of taking up smoking. Vink et al. Found that there was 44% smoking initiation, and genetics was explained through that. Nicotine dependence, 75% of the variation was explained by genetics. That was the Vink study. And then we also discussed depression. So research has shown that a first degree relative with depression could be 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with depression in their lifetime compared to the general population. Neurotransmitters are chemicals that transmit electrical messages from one nerve cell in the brain to another. An example of neurotransmitter imbalance, so schizophrenia is caused by overactivity of dopamine, which leads to symptoms such as hallucinations and delusions. Or you may have gone for depression, which is obviously low levels of serotonin, and that can affect things like your appetite, sleep, and your mood. Number 7, neurotransmitters. So we've talked about the fact that people might have low levels of dopamine, which is called dopamine deficiency, and then that can lead to people engaging in those addictive behaviours like smoking, drinking. Dopamine deficiency basically means low levels of dopamine, and that's dopamine deficiency is linked to depression and anxiety, and also substance dependency. And then you've got the last bit about diet. Okay, so thank you so much for listening. Hope you've enjoyed the lesson. If you need to go back through any of it, if you've missed any of the gaps or you don't understand anything, then please get in touch or rewind the video and feel free to watch it back again. Okay, thank you. Bye.